It's so nice to see you from the distance of level 4 and all the restrictions that has in place. Today's webinar is about mediation. So what it is, what happens when you attend, who's involved, and then what resolutions might come out of it, or what the next steps are from there. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start off. This recording will be available afterwards on the MyHR site. So if you do have to pause to go and attend something else, or if you miss a section, or if you want to come back and rewatch it because there's something that you wanted to look at again, you will be able to do that on our YouTube channel as well as on our myhr.works website as well. What this means is any questions that come up that we discuss will of course be recorded and available for other people to see. So please let me know if you'd like any questions to be kept anonymous, and make sure that you don't use any identifying details as well, just to make sure that we're all comfortable with what's being discussed in a public forum. So this is a topic that is quite dependent on the circumstances. It's a tool that makes sense in kind of tricksy, weird situations. So I'm expecting there will be lots of questions. If you do have questions, you're welcome to ask them as we go through the session. I'll then at the end collate everything and do a Q&A session towards the end of today. So if you have questions, ask them as we go through, or you are welcome to hold on to them and then blast them out when we get to the Q&A session at the end. Before we kick off, I guess I want to acknowledge that none of us thought we would be in level 4 today when we started putting the webinar together. There are lots of feelings that come up with level 4, and if you've been feeling isolated or anxious, or like you're having a bit of a tough time right now, those feelings are totally normal. I had a bit of a low day on Monday, so I'm right there with you all. Do talk to your managers. If there's EAP support at your business, do get in touch if you'd like to talk to someone. There's also a free 24/7 helpline that the government funds called Need to Talk. That number is 1737, and that's a text or a call number any time of the day or night. There's plenty of support out there. We're all in the same boat. It's a team of 5 million staying home to save lives. But if you are feeling a bit low or like you need a bit of support, please do reach out. There's plenty of support out there. So in terms of the main topic of today's session, we're talking about mediation. So we'll talk about what it is, who's involved. We'll go through the mechanics of what a mediation situation actually looks like. We'll then talk about the outcomes, like I mentioned earlier, and also discuss some of the situations where you might want to use mediation. It's not a tool that as many people are familiar with as I had expected. So we've had quite a positive response to this webinar. And as I go through, I'll do my best to put it in the context of all of the different times you might want to use it. But again, if you do have any questions, please just jump in and I'll answer them all towards the end. So mediation as a general process is where an independent third party comes in to intervene in a situation, or to help the parties who are involved resolve the dispute. It can be really hard when you are in the middle of a back and forth or a dispute to feel like you can kind of see a way out of it. When our emotions are running high, often our brain isn't kind of in a logical problem solving space. So getting someone else who's not kind of het up and who can help us navigate the issues can be a really helpful tool. So in an employment context, it is structured, but it's not formal. So what will happen is, it's unlike court proceedings. It's meant to be a very comfortable space. And of course it's confidential and it's without prejudice. So you can say things in a mediation session that you might not otherwise say, but we'll get to that a bit later. And in New Zealand, mediators are an unregistered industry. Unlike accountants who can become chartered, or lawyers who have to pass the bar and stay registered, or teachers, there's no formal registration or regulation requirements around mediators. They can get registered. You can do qualifications to become a mediator, and the Arbitration and Mediation Institute of New Zealand is one of the bodies that governs mediators in New Zealand, but you don't have to be licensed to call yourself a mediator. In the employment context as well, mediation is actually written into law in several different ways. So the Employment Relations Act, which sets up most of the foundation for employment relations in New Zealand, requires that MB, or the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, provides mediation services available to businesses and to people who need them. So it's also the preferred tool for resolving and addressing employment problems, which means that if you you have an employment agreement, it's actually one of the 10 things that you have to write into an employment agreement is how you will resolve any disputes that come up, because we're humans, building relationships with humans, disputes happen, and usually that clause in the employment agreement will make a reference to mediation as the preferred tool for addressing any disputes that do come up. It's the free mediation services from MB cover a couple of different situations. So where you have an employee in your business currently that you are trying to resolve an issue with, MB will provide mediation services to support that situation. If your employee or the organisation has raised a personal grievance, in most instances you will be directed to attend mediation as the first step. And again, if you've got an ex-employee who's trying to resolve an issue, mediation services are available in those circumstances as well. So the MB mediators are all professional. They're obviously representing a government agency. The majority of them have qualifications, and I believe all of them are licensed, but this is their bread and butter, right? They do this every day. So usually if you are trying to mediate with an existing employee, it will be about 1 to 2 weeks to get a mediator lined up, which is pretty quick, particularly for government services, if I do say so. If it's for an ex-employee or for someone who's raised a personal grievance, it can be a longer wait time because they're trying to prioritise employees who are still in the business to try and address those issues. It can be facilitated remotely, it can be done in person. Of course, at level 3 and level 4, most of it is done remotely, so over calls and Zoom and conferences and so on. But when it is in person, they do have offices around the country, which means that pretty much anywhere in the country, if you needed to, not under level 3 and 4, you could get a mediator in person to help you resolve the issue. So those are the MB services. There are, of course, also people who are licensed mediators or who provide mediation services privately. So there are circumstances where you might choose to pay for a mediator rather than getting one of the free MB mediators. This, as with most things, is a time versus money kind of question. If you wanted someone to come in more quickly than the 1 to 2 week waiting time for MB, a private mediator might be the way to go. So you do have options outside of the free government services. A couple of other pieces to note is that mediation is voluntary. So no one can be required to go to mediation if they don't want to. The idea being that it's a tool to navigate issues that come up in a relationship. And I don't know about you, but if I'm forced to be in a room where I don't want to be there and don't see a way forward, it's not going to be a constructive conversation. So again, it's voluntary. It's really important to note that. And the mediator, whether they're private or whether they're through MB, if there's an employment dispute being mediated, can't force you to a certain outcome or can't require that there is a certain outcome. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that voluntary piece is really important to stress. I touched on earlier the fact that mediation's a without prejudice environment. That phrase gets thrown around a lot. Sometimes it's talked about like an off-the-record conversation. Basically what without prejudice means is you can have an adult to adult kind of human conversation and say things that normally would prejudice an outcome later on. So I would never say to one of my team, if you don't improve, I'm going to fire you because you just aren't lifting your game. That basically means in the normal world, anything I try and do to help them feels threatening, it feels uncomfortable. I've also indicated that I will fire them at the end of the process, and I can't do that in our employment environment. What I have to do is always have an open mind about the outcome. However, in mediation, it's kind of like a black secret box where nothing talked in it gets referred to later on. So I could say, if you don't improve, I'm just going to fire you because this can't continue. Obviously, people can't unhear those kinds of things. So you do want to be a bit judicious about what you do share and say, but it removes the legal risk to saying things that in the normal course of business, you'd be a bit careful about saying. So that's what mediation is. It's a process to try and resolve an issue with a third party who's showing up there to help. And in terms of what happens and who's involved, I wanted to talk about the process a little bit so that you know more and can be more prepared to either use this as a tool yourselves or to respond to requests for mediation that come through in your life. So mediation can be triggered by either party to the relationship. Normally that's the employee who's frustrated about something or is raising a PG and wants their employer to front. It can also be the employer who's potentially tried to resolve the situation a few times and is having no luck and now needs some external help. So if you're using the free MB services, 98% of the time you will be, you'll fill out a form on the MB website that kind of explains the context and asks for a mediator to get in touch to set up a session. They'll then make contact with both parties and explain that there's a mediation request that's been filed, and then kind of book a time and make that all happen. So they're the admin also, because they're kind of setting up the session with everyone, and it basically is intended to, from the very beginning, de-escalate the feelings that you might have about the situation, because it's a third party who's got no interest. They're a public servant who's there to try and help resolve the situation. I do recommend most of the time that if you are invited to attend mediation, that you do go along. The value of attending is that you're showing to everyone who might be looking at the situation, whether it's the employee or their representation now or in the future, if it gets to a personal grievance stage, attending mediation shows that you're willing to try and resolve the situation and you're prepared to put time and money into doing so. If you choose not to attend mediation, you totally can. Again, it's voluntary, but it is a bit of a black mark on your record and on your standing for the negotiations or wherever things might go. So in the first instance, assume that attending mediation is a good idea. The other piece too is taking a representative to mediation is usually a good idea. There is a lot of nuance to employment law, which anyone who's ever worked with me or ever watched any of the MyHR webinars will know. So having someone who's able to come along and help you navigate that nuance and help with the negotiation side of things to achieve an outcome, whatever that might be, is normally quite a good idea. As a rule of thumb, we talk about every $1 you spend on representation, you save 5 at mediation if the outcome is kind of financial, and it isn't always, but having representation is never a bad idea. And if you can find someone who's your advocate and kind of has your back in the room, that can make a really big difference to how you feel showing up to a space that you probably don't spend a lot of time in, but also can make a real material and financial impact on the outcome of whatever the mediation situation is. So that's mediation, that's kind of how it gets triggered. We're now going to talk about what actually happens and what happens in the room when you've agreed to attend mediation. So the first thing that happens is yourself and your representation, and usually your employee and their representation, will be brought into one room by the mediator. So you're sitting around a table. I don't think it's round, it's usually rectangular. The ones I've seen have been. Maybe they have round tables somewhere, but the purpose is to have everyone in the room to agree on the fact that we're here to try and reach a resolution for the situation and to try and kind of move the relationship forward. So the party who has asked for the mediation starts. So if the employer has written to MB to say, I just need some help with Sylvie, she's doing my head in, I've tried all of these things to try and help her and it's kind of not landing, I need some support, the employer will open with their piece in their statement and sort of give their side of the story. If you've got representation, that representative will help you tell that story and be clear about what's happened, so you get a chance to talk it through. The mediator will then hand over to the responding party, which in this scenario would be me as the employee. And I get a chance to kind of say what I have to say. And again, if I've got representation, most employees will, then it's just a chance for me to kind of tell my story and give my side of things. So once that's happened in the room, there's some time to ask questions for the mediator to check in, and then the mediator will physically separate the parties and put you into 2 different conference rooms kind of down the hall from each other. The mediator then basically toddles back and forth between the meeting rooms to manage the discussion and manage the conversation. And what that allows is that you are not in the same room with the person that you are frustrated with or who is frustrated with you. Again, it's a de-escalation kind of technique to kind of keep the parties separate. And the mediator will also be, of course, translating whatever is given to him or her and making sure that it's a constructive discussion rather than just kind of sniping at each other or losing your temper and having a shout. So the ideal outcome is that at the end of the situation, there is an outcome, whatever that might be, and I'll talk about those in a second. The mediator, if they're from MB, is assessed on how many mediations they do resolve. It's a KPI for them. So they're not going to behave unethically, and they cannot make recommendations as to what one party should or shouldn't do. So they're not there to kind of pick a side, but they certainly are keen to get things resolved. And so if you are showing up to mediation in good faith with good reasons for what it is that you're trying to resolve, the mediator will see that and ends up doing quite a bit of work to support, I guess, the true justice of the situation. So they can be an ally in that sense. At least it's not an advocate who makes recommendations. So some of the things they might say are about the fairness of what's happening. If you show up full of bluster thinking that you're totally in the right, the mediator may give you some feedback to say, actually, these things here kind of weren't that fair and you have sort of misstepped. So you need to tone down your righteousness because you aren't perfectly in the right. There's a bit going on here. If you are talking about a settlement to resolve the situation, whatever that might be, they can also give advice around what's reasonable, what they're seeing a lot of, whether the expectations of one party or the other are too high or too low. So they're certainly there to facilitate, and facilitating doesn't mean being passive, but they can't say you should do X, Y, Z. What they can say is it's unlikely you will get the outcome you're looking for. This is a good offer in the context of what I'm seeing. So they can provide context like that. So that's what happens at mediation. You show up into a room, both sides get to say their piece, you get separated, and the mediator goes back and forth, kind of being the in-between. I want to talk now about what some problems are that you should use mediation for, because we've dived into the weeds and I want to pull us back to be thinking about what tool it is and what problems it can help solve. So there's, as always, in HR and employment law in New Zealand, a textbook approach and then a kind of pragmatic approach to what mediation is used for. The textbook approach is that it's a tool to resolve disputes or employment relationship problems so that everyone can kind of move forward in a healthy and constructive way. This means that pretty much any employment problem could be taken to mediation. The majority of the time it is between an employer and an employee. So this might be if your manager and the employee are clashing and you haven't been able to kind of facilitate a bit of a come together moment for them both to be singing Kumbaya together. It could be when you have an underperforming employee and you've tried so many different things to help them working and they're just doing your head in, and now you need a bit of help to address the situation, kind of get them to see what the issue is. There's, of course, when there's a personal grievance that's been raised, if it gets to the Employment Relations Authority and the employee or the advocate lodges it with the ERA, you will be directed back to mediation in the first instance. So it's voluntary, but it's kind of mandated. So there's a bit of a blurred line there. But in terms of attending within the employment relationship, you can show up with any kind of problem that needs resolving. Less commonly is when you have two employees who are clashing. So maybe the manager, if they're in the same team, has tried to mediate and get them to see each other's point of view and told them to stop acting like 12-year-olds and kind of behave in a bit more adult manner. If that's not working and they just aren't seeing eye to eye, getting mediation involved can do a few things. One, it shows them that you're taking it pretty bloody seriously because now there's some stranger from the government who's coming in and helping out. Two, it also does bring in someone whose professional skill set is negotiation and conflict resolution and mediation to try and resolve the issue. And third, it's kind of your last resort in terms of addressing the problem. And if you don't reach an outcome that's satisfactory by the end of that process, or if you do reach an outcome but kind of neither party plays ball or they just start acting like dickheads again, then you have the door open to other avenues to solve the situation now that you've given mediation a go. So that's the textbook approach. Pretty much anything can be taken to mediation. It's a service that's meant to be used. The pragmatic approach is that if a relationship with an employee in your business is unrecoverable, go to mediation to move them out of the business. So whether that's someone like Sylvie, who's underperforming and isn't responding to maybe a PIP or to other guidance and coaching, when someone's just a really poor fit for your business and you can kind of demonstrate why they are a poor fit, mediation is the way to go. Where it's a personal grievance that has been raised, even if it's speculative or not kind of founded in fact, mediation is the path to go. Basically, it's a safe space to talk about moving someone on from your business. and it happens all the time. It's really common. My piece of advice here is that if you are planning to go to mediation, the more you can bring with you to show that you've been a good employer to try and resolve and address the situation, the better, and by better I mean cheaper, outcome you're likely to get. If you were to show up to mediation and say, I've never given Sylvie any feedback, she's never had a PIP or a performance review, I haven't given her any coaching, so she probably doesn't even know that she's underperforming because I've never told her what my expectations are, but I'm just kind of sick of her, can we move her on? You don't have a lot of leverage in that situation. I'm going to take you to the cleaners because you haven't kind of fairly treated me or fairly engaged with me in the process, and I'm going to want and will probably be given a lot of money to go. So you can do that. You can just shortcut everything and go straight to mediation. But if you show up to mediation saying, Sylvie's had 2 performance improvement plans, she's had regular coaching and support, here are all the documents I've given her to show where my expectations are, here are the metrics around where she needs to be compared to her peers, here's the coaching and the one-on-ones and the coffee dates I've taken her on, I just don't think we're going to get anywhere because I've done so much and Sylvie hasn't kind of met me. That's a lot of leverage to get a good outcome at mediation, and it's also a lot for the mediator to work with. They will kind of be on your side in this because they can see that you've done all of the work to support Sylvie and Sylvie hasn't been performing. So the textbook approach, mediations for any situation. The pragmatic approach is it's kind of the secret back office before you kick someone out the back door if they're not working out. But the more that you can do in the real world to show that you are trying to help someone, the more leverage you'll have to go to mediation to get a cheaper outcome rather than just shortcutting process and going there entirely. We will advise clients to go to mediation in most of those circumstances, particularly given how stretched everyone is this year. I mean, if you let alone COVID, there's a lot kind of happening, then it can be a really quick tool to move people on who aren't a good fit for the business. So that's kind of everything from me. It's a lot to process and a lot to take in. So just to really quickly recap, we've talked about what mediation is, what problems it's designed to solve. We've talked about what triggers mediation and who's involved. We've talked about the mechanics. We've talked about what problems we should use it for. And I didn't cover off what some of the outcomes might be. So sorry, that's my mistake. So there are pretty much an infinite range of outcomes that may come out of mediation. Most of the time, it is a financial settlement for the employee to leave the business, or for the employee to drop their personal grievance claim. So usually some nonsense money or go away money does exchange from you to the employee. But there are plenty of other solutions. So one outcome might be reinstatement. If they've left the business under poor circumstances, or if they've misunderstood that they weren't required or expected to leave the business but did resign, reinstatement might be appropriate. If there is a performance issue, you might agree on any range of performance outcomes. It might be regular meetings, it might be a performance improvement plan, it might be coaching, it might be some dedicated training to help with technical skills. Any kind of combination of outcomes might be agreed. If there is a conduct or fit issue, you also might agree that there is a set of expectations around behavior. You might agree for them to get some coaching around how it is appropriate to behave at work if that's the problem. You might have some specific metrics about, saying hi to your colleagues in the morning. Pretty much anything might come out of it as a resolution from here. So there's a combo of outcomes. Like I said, most of the time some money does exchange hands, but depending on the situation, of course, you can agree to practically any outcome as long as both parties are into it. The other thing I will say here, just before wrapping and taking questions, and there have been things come through, which is really helpful, so thank you for sending those through, and start sending them. We're about to jump into our Q&A session. The two parties can agree to give the mediator binding authority on an outcome, which means the mediator says what happens and you'll just have to comply with that. Most of the time you won't, because you don't want to give the mediator kind of unbounded authority to make a determination about what the outcome is, but you can do if you're just getting nowhere and think that could be helpful. Again, most of the time the mediator can't make decisions. They can only make those calls if you explicitly both give them the power to do so. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So that was everything from me, quite a lot of content. I'm keen to take some questions and see what has come through out of all of that, because there are obviously some specifics where the circumstances will be different. So I'll jump into our Facebook Live session and just see if any questions have come through on the comments there. And then I'll come back to the webinar and check the Q&A session here as well. So if you're thinking of a question or would like to ask it, kind of now's the time. Cool. Looks like we have not had any questions come through on the Facebook Live, which is great. So I will jump back into the Zoom webinar. Cool. So Tracy, hi Tracy, has asked, if you are going to get a settlement agreement signed through a mediator, will it still take 1 to 2 weeks for this to happen? That's a great question. The short answer is no. So when you have signed a record of settlement with an employee, which is basically full and final, everyone gives up their claims, the terms of the settlement, again, usually involve a payment, but don't always. You need to then log that through mediation services so that a mediator signs off on it, which is the completion of the process, and it means that they have a copy of it if the employee or yourself tries to take further action in future. So it takes about 15 minutes to submit a record of settlement online on the mediation site. You will need a RealMe login, which you, I believe, can create at a post office or maybe can create online these days. I've had mine for years, so things might have changed. It's about 15 minutes to submit. You'll normally get a call back from a mediator within about 2 working days to check. And what will happen is the mediator will call you, assuming you're the employer, to say, do you understand what you're signing? Do you agree that you haven't missed minimum wage or anything like that? Do you have any questions? It's about a 60-second phone call. They'll kind of sign it off on your side. They'll then call the employee and say, do you agree to what you're signing to? Do you know that the terms and conditions? Do you agree that you're not foregoing minimum wage entitlements? Is everything okay? So that's about 2 working days. Sometimes it can be a day. I've had a mediator call me same day, which is pretty amazing. But anything up to 3 working days in those circumstances is pretty normal, Tracy. Cool. Anonymous has asked, is this usually before it goes to the Employment Relations Authority, or is it the same thing? That's a great question. It's not the same thing, and it's usually before you go to the Employment Relations Authority. So there is a kind of chain of events which happen when a personal grievance has been raised, and that normally goes personal grievance raised, first written response by the employer, employee requests mediation, mediation happens or doesn't, and then it gets lodged with the Employment Relations Authority. If anyone tries to shortcut these processes and go straight to the Employment Relations Authority, they will tell you to go to mediation before bothering them with this situation, because mediation's the written into law method for solving these types of disputes. So most of the time you will have gone to mediation before you get to the Employment Relations Authority, if it's kind of in the PG sequence of events. There's also a bunch of mediating that happens that isn't in kind of a PG sort of world. An employer might ask an employee to come because they have some performance concerns they just want to be really blunt about. There might be, as I talked about earlier, 2 employees who are clashing, who aren't getting on, so the employer's getting a mediator involved. So there's a bunch that happens kind of out in this world before, which is unconnected to the Employment Relations Authority. Susie asks, what happens if mediation is a complete fail? Thanks for your question, Susie. That's a really good one. It depends a bit on the circumstances. So if mediation has failed and that no outcome has been reached, it depends what you were trying to solve at mediation, which will then determine what your next steps are. So if you as an employee, for example, have concerns about your employment, and that might have been you think that your annual leave is not being paid to you correctly, or you think that you were disadvantaged when your employer restructured and you didn't get the same job that you had before, or any of those sorts of issues. If mediation has failed, you should seek legal advice if you haven't already to see if you have a personal grievance claim. That is kind of the next step in the hierarchy of actions you can take as an employee. As an employer, if mediation fails because you haven't reached an outcome everyone's happy with, again, depending on the situation, if it was a performance issue, you might want to take disciplinary action to move things along. If it's a behavior or a conduct issue, same thing, potentially disciplinary action. And if you are trying to mediate between two employees who are causing you problems, it might be disciplinary action for one or both of those, or in very, very rare circumstances, you can call frustration of contract as a grounds for terminating one or either of the employees. In all of those worlds, you should seek specific legal advice about the problem, because the next steps after mediation, like I said, will kind of branch off and depending on what the issue is that you're trying to resolve. There's usually always a next step, but it may not be quick to get there, would be my advice. Anonymous has asked, if an employee is not seeking any monetary compensation as an outcome from mediation, would the outcome still be documented in a settlement agreement, or would it be documented some other way to ensure everyone is clear that the personal grievance has resolved? That's a really good question, Anonymous. Thank you for posting that. It depends whether you're at mediation to answer a PG or not, and what the outcomes are. So in a world where you are responding to a PG, the employee might not be asking for any monetary compensation. They might be asking for something else. Where you are resolving a conflict or an issue that's come up, you might never have been considering whether to pay them to go. You might genuinely be there to try and resolve the issue. So you would only sign a record of settlement if you are certainly giving an employee something more than their entitlements, and usually if their employment is ending through mediation. Whatever the circumstance, the outcomes of mediation should be documented. So even if the outcome is that the employer agrees to put Sylvie on a PIP and to be clear about expectations, that needs to be written down, and then the PIP needs to happen. So the outcomes will be documented, even if the outcome is no outcome, like we couldn't get to a resolution. A record of settlement is a tool that is used to kind of close off a relationship and close off any claims that might come through. And that's not always appropriate depending on what the situation is you're trying to resolve. You didn't specifically ask this, but if an employee does leave the business, or if you are settling or responding to a PG with anything that isn't financial compensation, yes, a record of settlement is still used. I wrote a record of settlement a couple of days ago, which looked at an extension to a notice period rather than kind of an immediate cash money payment. And I documented that in a record of settlement because it's important that kind of wraps the employee's claims and resolves the situation. So depending on context, you may or may not use a record of settlement. Just jumping up to a couple more questions. Melissa has said, as soon as someone presents as a potential problem, they get a file and a copy of everything goes in there. This has served me very well. Melissa, it sounds like you're talking about an employee who's in the business still. I totally agree that you should be documenting any concerns or issues that you have and talking to your employees about them. No one's a mind reader. We all like to think we are sometimes, but if you're not clear with your employees about your expectations, it's very hard for them to live up to those standards. So totally agree that things should be documented. Steve asks, is it advisable to take a professional advisor along to mediation from an employer's perspective, or can an employer represent themselves? Great question, Steve. Thank you. You certainly can represent yourself at mediation. I don't recommend it. It can get quite challenging and quite contentious. A professional advocate will be able to help you navigate the nuances of the situation, and also they will usually have some negotiation skills that employers may not bring to the room. As a rule of thumb, we talk about every dollar you spend on representation will save you $5 at mediation, again, depending what the circumstances are. So if it's you showing up just to tell Sylvie that she's a bit rubbish and then to pick her game up, and you want to do that in a safe environment, you might not need representation. That's pretty safe. If you are responding to a personal grievance claim, or if you're showing up with the intention of moving on an employee you don't want in the business any longer, I would always recommend that you do have professional representation, just like I would if you were paying your taxes and getting an accountant, or if you were, defending a criminal claim. Representation is important. Anonymous asks, an ex-employee left. We signed a settlement agreement with them, and they now have advised they believe they've been underpaid for on-call hours and are raising a PG. If we go to mediation, can we bring in the fact that we've already completed a settlement? That's a great question, Anonymous. Sorry, I nearly said your name. There are some circumstances where a record of settlement will not cover you for all eventualities. So where new information comes up to the employee after the record of settlement has been signed, and they can demonstrate that it's a completely new matter that they've never touched on before, they may be able to raise a personal grievance because they didn't know that this bad thing was happening, alleged bad thing. And if they had, that might have changed their negotiations for that record of settlement. So you should take along the previous record of settlement to the next mediation meeting. That's really helpful. But there are some circumstances where employees can and employers too can get out of the record of settlement or raise kind of new proceedings related to a concern. Anonymous asks, what would happen if an employee refuses to go to mediation? What steps would you take if that were the case? That's a great question. It depends a lot on the circumstance. So because mediation is voluntary, you can't require anyone to go. That's totally correct. If the employee is causing real headaches in the business, I would pretty quickly look to take disciplinary action, whether that's kind of them behaving like a knob and not fitting in, whether that's them not hitting their sales targets or being rude to customers and it's a performance issue. There's always a next step. It just depends on what the circumstances are that will determine what the next step is there. So if an employee refuses and they're causing problems, definitely deal with it. Don't just leave it and assume it will get better. Most of the time it won't. And then do seek some professional help. So if you're a MyHR client, give us a call, or if you have an advocate that you work with, have a chat. They'll be able to guide you on what the next appropriate steps are. My question, Anonymous asks, my question about recording outcomes when no monetary compensation occurs was around responding to a PG from an ex-employee who has issues with the current employee's behaviour while employed and wants to know the employee has been dealt with. This gets really difficult because you can't talk about what you're doing with employee A with employee B most of the time. You have privacy and confidentiality obligations to them. So just like most of the time, we will ask our employees not to discuss things like salary because it's private. We also then can't talk to other employees about how other colleagues of theirs were dealt with. So depending on the circumstances, if the employee who's left and is raising the PG has raised a formal complaint about something, there's a whole kind of investigative and reporting process that goes on there. If they're just having a bit of a whine and a moan, then you probably won't be able to tell them. So it's very context specific, I'm sorry. So give us a call if you're a client, seek advice from an advocate, and we'll give you some guidance on the best way to deal with that employee. Anonymous asks, how long does it take to clear off your name if you ever got into employment conflict with your employer, especially if moving for another role elsewhere? That's a magic question, Anonymous, and it's a real how long is a piece of string piece. Wow, where do I start with that one? So if you, as an employer or an employee, have ever gone to the Employment Relations Authority and the Employment Relations Authority has made a determination, like have kind of address the case, there is a public record available to anyone who's got the internet and a computer to download and see what that determination was. Depending on circumstances, sometimes they will say, you know, Mrs. T or Mr. A, if there's some privacy concerns. Most of the time it's your full name on there. So if you've gone to the Employment Relations Authority and there has been a determination, that will be publicly searchable until they decide to stop publishing determinations. So it's not great for employees because you do get tarred with a bit of a brush of being a troublemaker, and it's not good for employers because you then look like you're a bad employer who treats your employees poorly. So if it goes to the ERA, it's publicly available. In terms of clearing your name elsewhere, if it's an employer who you can afford not to have a reference from, then maybe just don't put them down as a reference. There is certainly anti-defamation laws around. So if an employer or an employee is bad-mouthing the other one, there are ways to address that. You can apply for an injunction from the Employment Relations Authority to stop the bad behaviour. But in terms of clearing your name, if you've burned bridges with an employer or with an employee, there will probably be some consequences from that. And it might just be not having a reference, or it might be, if it's a small industry you're in, that can get around sometimes. Again, if you need help, get in touch or talk to a lawyer, and they'll be able to talk to you about the best ways forward. Peter asks, hey Peter, does MyHR offer mediation services? Yes, we do. So Lisa Oakley, who's one of my team, is a licensed mediator with AMINS, which is that Arbitration and Mediation Institute. So she is a professional mediator who can show up in a private capacity. She's also the one of my team who I would be sending to attend mediation with employers as their representative or their advocate. So whether you would like private in-house mediation, we can support you with that. Whether you'd like representation in a conflict, either in responding to a PG or mediation, we can support you with that as well. So yes, we do. Last question, and then we've got a couple more. Sorry, last couple of questions and then we'll wrap up. So Anonymous asks, if an employee tells you that they are looking for other work, what are our options as an employer? Great question. You don't have many is the short answer. So depending on how your employment agreement is written, and if you're a MyHR client, it'll be written in the helpful way. An employee, again, depending on this clause, can't give you more notice than is written into their employment agreement. So if someone comes to you with a resignation letter and says, hey, Sylvie, I'm resigning. My employment agreement says 4 weeks, but I'm giving you 3 months notice because I want to wait until the borders open and I'm going to go to Australia and do my OE. I can say, thanks for your resignation. Actually, we don't have to accept 3 months. We're taking 4 weeks only. So your employment actually ends in 4 weeks. So I don't have to wait for no 12-week notice period. That's a bit nuts. So if you have it in there and it's as formal a resignation as that, you can manage it that way. If an employee just says, I'm planning to leave, I'm not really happy here, I'm looking for other work, you can't punish them, you can't fire them. You basically just have to work with them to either keep them happy while they sort of transition out, or support them with a transition if they're otherwise a really good employee and a good member of the team, and they're being professional by giving you a heads up. That's a good situation. Unfortunately, most of the ones that I see are people going, you know, I hate it here, I'm going to piss off and you'll never see me again, and as soon as I get another job, bye hokey, you'll miss me, and that can be a pretty toxic environment. So mediation could potentially be an avenue to resolve that. It would be a bit hard to get good leverage for a cheap outcome to get them to move on, but do give us a call or have a talk to your advocacy and support group. And by support group, I mean professional support, to see if there's a way forward. Melissa has asked, does that still need to be within 90 days? Yes, that's a great question, Melissa. So a personal grievance from an employee or an employer needs to be raised within 90 days of the incident happening, which has triggered the grounds for the grievance. So there are some circumstances where employees or employers can raise grievances outside of that time frame, but the starting point is those 90 days. Mediation can happen when an employee is still in the business. So there's kind of no counting clock. They're just a member of the team who needs some help. Or if the PG is raised on, let's say, day 85, and then there's a response, and then the employee kind of triggers a mediation request, that will probably happen well outside the 90-day time frame, and that's fine because it's just a part of that kind of PG process. So mediation doesn't need to be within 90 days. A personal grievance does though, and that will sometimes trigger a mediation obligation, which might happen within or without. Awesome. Okay, that was everyone's questions. These sessions really come alive when there is some audience engagement and are questions for us to talk about. So thank you very much to everyone who sent questions through, whether anonymous or otherwise. Just to quickly recap, the session will be available on the MyHR YouTube channel as well as the MyHR website in the next couple of days if you want to watch back. But otherwise, any questions, feel free to call us. We're on 0800 69 4769. Again, that's 0800 69 4769. I've been Sylvie Thrush Marsh. It's such a pleasure to talk to you all as always, and stay safe in level 4, and we'll see you next time.